So I've got this thing for old universities, and several years ago I was traveling in central Spain and I got to visit the fourth oldest university in all of Europe, which is the University of Salamanca. This university is almost 1,000 years old, and I got to visit the oldest building, and I came up against this wall here, and I got the story of why this wall looked the way it did. So hundreds of years before there was internal plumbing, the students who were working hard in the library, which was just next door, when they wanted to relieve themselves, they didn't want to trek all the way outside to the latrine. And so what they would do is they did what undergraduates have been doing all along, which is they come and just urinate where they shouldn't. And they urinated on this wall. And the administration had to figure out some way of dealing with these urinating undergraduates. And so what they did was, instead of putting up CCD cameras, which wouldn't be invented for 500 years, they painted these pictures of saints under the expectation that if you're about to pee on the wall, and you see your saints, you're going to think twice about violating that norm. Now, years later, I'm telling this story to a student, and she tells me that when she was traveling in Nepal, there was another wall, and it also had gods painted on it. And she was told that it was for exactly the same reason. They didn't want people peeing on that wall, and so they painted gods to deter that. It was a different continent, it was a different religion, but it was the same idea. And that idea is this idea of supernatural deterrence, using the threat of supernatural punishment to deter people from engaging in counter-normative behavior. And that is at the heart of what's called the supernatural punishment hypothesis. Now, in a previous lecture, we talked about how monogamous marriage norms could reduce intrasexual competition. And by doing so, they would make groups stronger and more cohesive. In this lecture, we're going to talk about one of the most significant and probably necessary factors in increasing group cohesion, and that's cooperation. Now, the challenge of getting large groups of people to cooperate together has been one of the key factors that's limited human group sizes during the vast history of our species to about 20 to 50 people. And that was small enough so that you would know every single person in your group. But more importantly, it meant that every single person would know you, and they would know what you did. That meant that everybody had to be very careful with their behavior to ensure a good reputation. A norm violator would be quickly known, with knowledge of their violation quickly spreading throughout the entire group, and thus compromising their standing as a good and trustable member of the tribe. As a result, humans have become both highly sensitive and protective about their own reputations, and also highly attuned to recognizing normative violations in others. But the problem is, beyond a particular group size, which anthropologists put at about 150 people, our cognitive ability to keep track of everybody's moral reputations falter, and certain people turn into anonymous strangers. That means that these anonymous strangers can violate the norms while still avoiding the reputational costs of doing so. And it turns out that without an explicit solution to that problem, groups can't function. Under the protection of anonymity, individuals will cheat and free ride on the group, contributing less and taking more. With everybody pursuing their own self-interests, the groups either fission or collapse altogether. That's why we tend not to have seen any hunter-gatherer groups with more than 150 people. But over the last 12,000 years, we've of course seen group sizes swell well beyond those numbers, and that raises the important question of what changed? What allowed us to cooperate at levels high enough to break through that barrier? So one of the more provocative hypotheses for how these larger groups were able to develop and remain somewhat harmonious, despite our inborn limitations, is that religion, and specifically the deterrence value of supernatural punishment, encouraged enough cooperation among large groups of anonymous strangers. Under the gaze, or at least under the believed gaze, of a supernatural watcher, those corners where people could previously feel anonymous and feel like they could anonymously engage in norm violation now no longer felt that way. And people anxious to protect their reputations not just with other people, but with God, reduced their tendency to cheat and free ride. Now, if that idea is true, we can make certain predictions. One is very simple, that people should be more norm following when they're reminded of God. So in one of the early studies to test that hypothesis, Arnor and Zine and I divided our sample into two groups. In one of them, we tried to subtly draw the attention of the people to the concept of God. And in the other group, we just left them relatively undisturbed. They were the control condition. So then we took these two groups, the control condition and the God-primed group, and had them play a game borrowed from experimental economics, the dictator game. And what it does is it gives one subject an allotment of money. In our study, that was 10 Canadian dollars. And it gives another subject nothing. But the first subject, who's called the dictator, has the opportunity to share some of what's been allotted to him or her with the other participant, and they can do so in any denomination that they want. So the dictator can do the equitable thing. Since these were two people who ended up in the same situation, just randomly, one got $10 and the other didn't, the dictator could just split it 50-50, both walk away with $5. Or the dictator could be more selfish and could keep, say, $9 for themselves and give just $1 to the non-dictator, the recipient. Or the dictator could do what most people do in this experiment, which is just keep all $10 for themselves and give nothing to the other participant. Now, in this variant of the dictator game, these two participants were kept anonymous from each other, and their decision, the dictator's decision, was kept confidential from the experimenters. As a result, the dictator faced no reputational costs for being selfish in this case, or at least they faced no earthly reputational costs. The idea was that the group that had been primed with God would now be more concerned about their reputation, not just with humans, but also with God themselves. And as a result, that would compel them to be more generous in this otherwise anonymous situation. So what did people do? Well, in the control condition, they did what people in control conditions in dictator games typically do. The modal response, that is the response that the plurality of people did, was that they kept all the money for themselves. All the dictators kept all $10 for themselves. And the average amount that the dictators gave to the recipient was about 2 of the $10. But in that group who'd been primed with God, in that group who'd been subtly led to think about God concepts before they made this decision, the modal response now shifted to that equitable $5. That is, more participants split the money 50-50 than chose any other option. And the average amount that was given was over $4. So this is consistent with what we'd hypothesized. When people think about God, it shifts their behavior to being more moral. So since that study, a number of other studies have used that same basic paradigm to show that when people are primed with God, when they're subtly led to think about God, they also become more cooperative and they become less likely to cheat, they become more charitable, and they become more willing to volunteer. All things that would be to the benefit of the group, even if they're costly to the individual. Now, those were all sort of artificial lab-based tasks. How much does that type of religious priming actually occur in everyday life? Well, when I lived in Eugene, Oregon, this was the view from outside of my apartment. Now, Eugene is one of the least churched cities in all of the United States. I think it's the 5th or 6th least religious metropolitan area in the whole country. And yet, every morning, this church was staring me in the face. I also had the opportunity to teach at New York University's campus in Abu Dhabi. And there, this was the view from my apartment window. Now, you can clearly see that one mosque, but if you look closely, there's actually 2 other mosques that are visible. And so now every morning, there were these 3 mosques that were staring me in the face. But any of you who've spent any time in Muslim-majority countries will know that it's not a visual cue that is the most salient reminder of religion. It's an auditory cue. It's the call to prayer, which blares across the entire city 5 times a day. There have been at least a couple of research groups who've used that naturally occurring religious prime of the call to prayer to see if it affects moral behavior. In one of these, a PhD student named Eric Duhaime went to Morocco and played a variant of that dictator game with Moroccan shopkeepers. And he noted which games were playing when the call to prayer was going off and compared those to the games played when it wasn't. Now, the Moroccan shopkeepers were pretty generous overall, but when the call to prayer was going off while they were playing the game, every single one of those Moroccan shopkeepers gave the maximum amount that they could in the dictator game, keeping actually nothing for themselves. What I like about those studies is that they use these naturally occurring religious primes. They don't use these artificial lab tasks, but instead use something which is in people's face or in people's ears in the real world. So a pair of Harvard economists have used a different type of naturally occurring religious prime in the day of Sunday. And this is what they call the Sunday effect. They argue that simply the day of Sunday serves as a religious prime to a big chunk of a predominantly Christian country like the United States. So one of the researchers looked at charitable donations on a website, and this particular website would solicit donations from people who'd previously donated. And so they looked at how these donations varied across the various days, and specifically they looked at how that effect was moderated by whether the donator was a religious person or a non-religious person. And what they found was that on every other day, that is the days when there wasn't this naturally occurring religious prime, religious people and non-religious people gave the same amount. And that's actually consistent with what you find in the psychological literature. When there's no religious prime, religious people and non-religious people seem just equally as generous. But the difference was on Sundays. There you did see a significant effect where more religious people gave than did non-religious people. So that researcher's colleague did a separate study where instead of looking at charitable behavior, he looked at pornography consumption. And in particular, he compared pornography consumption in highly religious areas of the United States versus less religious places. And what he found was that there was generally equal porn consumption, except again on the day of Sunday, when in the more religious places, you saw a sharp, significant drop in people watching porn. But you didn't see a comparable drop in other types of media like watching TV or visiting websites where people have their clothes on. And then on Monday, you see this bounce back effect where they go right back to watching just as much porn. So depending on your moral perspective on charity and pornography, these naturally recurring religious primes do get people to act more morally for at least a little while. Now, we've been talking specifically about supernatural punishment, not supernatural reward. The reason for that is that both theory and evidence suggest that supernatural punishment is considerably more effective. In 2011, Noren Zein and I published a paper where we looked at students' cheating behavior. And what we did is we put students in a situation where they had a really annoying math task that made it very tempting for them to cheat. And then we looked at which ones did and which ones didn't. Importantly, we also got a measure of their view of God, the degree to which they saw God as loving and comforting and forgiving, but also the degree to which they saw God as vengeful and punishing and angry. And what we found is that the more punitive their view of God, and the less loving and comforting their view of God, the less likely they were to cheat. Now, this is just a correlational study. But since that paper came out, the Turkish psychologists Yilmaz and Bahçekapli have done an experimental version of that using religious priming. And what they found was that only when you prime the punishing aspects of religion does it make people act more ethically. Now, in a similar line of research, Dr. Ben Perzicki and his colleagues have recently conducted a large-scale, cross-cultural, multi-site study where they specifically looked at what characteristics of God most relate to cooperation. What this research suggests is that supernatural punishment is an effective force for increasing norm-following behavior. It decreases cheating and free riding, and it increases cooperation. But it also spreads trust. So the threat of supernatural punishment deters you, but if you know that somebody else, even somebody that you really haven't met, also believes in that threat, then you can trust that they're going to be similarly deterred and are going to similarly stick to their cultural norms. Being similarly motivated by the threat of supernatural punishment means that they're going to be similarly moral, and thus they're also going to be trustworthy. So this helps explain why features of supernatural punishment, such as punitive deities and morally dependent afterlives, are recurrent features throughout religions over time. Supernatural punishment is not a necessary feature of religions. There are religions in which supernatural punishment features much less heavily. But those religions that stumbled on this particular belief gave their host societies a competitive advantage in the form of a more cooperative and as a result more stable, productive, and prosperous populace. Now, there are 2 points that I want to stress before we close this lecture. The first is that supernatural punishment represents one culturally adaptive feature of religion, one among many. You'll recall from an earlier module that we talked about how religions can provide existential security in a world that's chaotic and uncertain and full of these mortal bodies where we're going to die. But we noted that religion's promises of afterlives serve as a literal promise of immortality, helping us deny death, and that's something which gives us comfort. But here you can see how afterlives can serve double duty. In fact, afterlife beliefs are an excellent example of multiple features of the cognitive science of religion working in tandem. So our inability to conceive of nothingness makes conceptualizing what death is actually like abstract and really difficult. And that, coupled with our intuitive sense of mind-body dualism, makes a life after death very thinkable. So it's an intuitive thing to believe that afterlives exist. And once that happens, different ideas of afterlives can spread because they quell existential desires for immortality, or also because certain versions of a morally dependent afterlife offer these social benefits by serving as a moral deterrent. So you can see here how features of the human mind offer up the raw materials that make up religion. And from there, cultural evolutionary processes shape those raw materials into functional adaptations. And so religions, like Swiss Army knives, end up cobbled together of these different elements that evolved for different reasons and at different times. And those elements get their power from being connected to each other, and thus religions end up being these packages that are greater than the sum of their parts. Now, the second point that I wanted to make concerns a question that naturally follows from the discussion that we've been having about religious primes and how they encourage cooperative behavior. And that question is, are they necessary? Is religion necessary to encourage cooperation at the levels that we now see? Now here, the answer is a clear no. There are many routes to cooperation, and there have been many mechanisms that have been identified by psychology that encourage moral behavior. Now, this helps explain why some of the most harmonious and functional countries on the planet happen to be some of the least religious. How have these countries managed to get there? Well, one strong explanation is that cooperation is achieved through a trusted set of secular institutions that let the rule of law be the deterrent rather than the fear of God. In fact, in one of our experiments, the one where you had the different groups playing the dictator game, I neglected to mention a third condition that we had, and that was instead of priming people with God, we primed people with secular institutions, things like contracts or the police or justice. And priming people with these institutions happened to produce the same increase in generosity as did priming people with the God concepts. But this type of centralized set of secular institutions wasn't always possible. Aronor Zion describes this process by which some states graduated from religious to secular institutions as, quote, climbing the ladder and then kicking it. These states were able to grow to a certain level because of religion, and then once they reached the size where the secular institutions could do the trick, then they no longer needed religion. And indeed, if you look across countries, the strength of the rule of law is one of the strongest negative predictors of the importance of religion. All of this is to suggest that the places with high rates of atheism can still be remarkably cooperative. The atheists just respond to different deterrents. So that means that from a moral perspective, people shouldn't really have any problem with atheists, right? Well, we'll find out in the next lecture.